All right, you beautiful bastard. You want to dig into some Canadian military history? Buckle up, because this shit's going to blow your mind. You think Canada's all about politeness and moose? Think again, buddy. Turns out these peace-loving Canucks have a past full of battles, wars, and political fuck-ups that would make your head spin.
It's a wild ride, that's for sure. We're talking centuries of conflict, shifting alliances, brutal realities.
Yeah, we're going to go deep, peel back the layers of Canadian history, and expose the blood and guts beneath those maple syrup smiles. Let's cut the crap and start way back before Canada was even a twinkle in some colonial asshole's eye.
We need to start with the Indigenous peoples. They were far from a monolithic group, constantly engaged in skirmishes and forming alliances long before Europeans arrived. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy was a powerful force, constantly battling for dominance.
Right, the Iroquois. They weren't exactly known for their hospitality, were they?
Yeah.
Some messed up shit about how they treated their captives.
Well, their approach to warfare was pretty brutal. They didn't always kill their captives. Instead, they'd often adopt them into their tribes to replace fallen warriors. It was a way to maintain their strength and replenish their ranks.
So forced assimilation. Talk about a hostile takeover.
It was a pretty grim reality. And lest we forget, some tribes, like the Haida on the Pacific coast, practiced slavery. They'd capture their enemies and turn them into property. This shit was often hereditary, too, so those poor bastards were stuck in a cycle of servitude.
Hold the phone, Canada had slaves. I thought that was a strictly American thing.
Sadly, it's a dark side of Canadian history that often gets overlooked. Slavery existed among several Indigenous groups, particularly in the Pacific Northwest.
Damn, learn something new every day.
Yeah.
So when those European assholes showed up, did these tribal alliances play a role in the colonial power struggle?
Absolutely. The French and the British were constantly vying for control of Canada, and they both sought to exploit Indigenous alliances to gain an edge. It added a whole new layer of complexity to the conflicts, turning them into a messy three-way dance of death.
All right, those beaver wars. Talk about fighting over the most Canadian shit ever.
The Beaver Wars were a series of brutal conflicts that raged across the 17th century. They were fueled by the fur trade, which was booming back then. Beavers were the hot commodity, and whoever controlled them held the keys to a shit ton of wealth.
So basically they were fighting over who got to wear the fanciest goddamn hats. Typical.
In a way, yes. But the stakes were incredibly high. These wars were bloody and merciless. The Iroquois Confederacy allied with the Dutch, and later the English went head-to-head against New France and its indigenous allies.
And the French were tight with the Huron and Algonquin tribes, right? They must have been shitting bricks when the Iroquois came knocking.
The French heavily relied on those alliances. They even armed their indigenous allies with European weapons, giving them more firepower in the process.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. But didn't those alliances get kind of messy? Weren't loyalties constantly shifting?
Absolutely. It was a constantly evolving landscape of power. One day you're allies, the next day you're stabbing each other in the back.
Sounds like a real-life Game of Thrones, eh? Betrayals, alliances, and everyone fighting for a piece of the Canadian pie.
It's a very apt analogy, and just like in Game of Thrones, these power struggles led to some epic battles. The Siege of Quebec in 1690, the capture of Louisbourg in 1758, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. These clashes shaped the destiny of Canada, determining who would ultimately control this vast and resource-rich land.
Okay, so lots of fighting, shifting alliances. Eventually, Canada emerged as a nation right. Did that put an end to all the bloodshed?
Not a chance. The birth of Canada didn't magically usher in an era of peace and harmony.
Figures. So what was the first war independent Canada got itself tangled up in? Did they jump right back into the shit?
Well, technically Canada wasn't fully independent yet, but in 1812, the Americans decided they wanted a piece of the Canadian pie and launched an invasion.
Seriously? Those arrogant bastards really think Canadians would just roll over and say, "Welcome to America, eh?"
The Americans underestimated the tenacity of both the British and the Canadians. They also underestimated the vital role that indigenous allies like the legendary Shawnee leader Tecumseh would play in the conflict.
Tecumseh, eh? That dude was a badass warrior. I bet he gave the Americans hell.
He was a brilliant strategist and a fierce leader. He fought alongside the British and Canadian forces, playing a key role in several victories. His death in 1813 was a major blow to the resistance.
So the Canadians and their allies managed to kick the Americans' asses. Good for them.
I bet
that pissed off those Yanks.
The War of 1812 was a defining moment for Canada. It solidified a sense of national identity, instilled a healthy dose of rivalry with the U.S., and proved that Canadians wouldn't just back down when challenged.
Damn right. Those Canucks have some grit beneath those polite exteriors. But hold on, they fought the Americans in 1812, and then just a few decades later, they're fighting for the British in the Boer War. What the hell, Canada? Make up your minds.
It might seem contradictory, but the rebellions of 1837-38 provide some context.
The rebellions, what were those all about?
Canadians were getting restless. They wanted more autonomy, more say in their own affairs. They weren't necessarily trying to completely sever ties with Britain, but they were definitely pushing for more independence.
So it was like a teenager going through a rebellious phase, slamming doors, demanding more freedom, but not quite ready to move out of their parents' basement?
That's a pretty good analogy. And despite their rebellious streak, when the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa in 1899, thousands of Canadians volunteered to fight for the British Empire.
What the fuck was in it for them? Why risk their necks in some far-off war that had nothing to do with them?
It's a complex question. Some were motivated by loyalty to the empire, while others saw it as an opportunity for adventure or a chance to prove their worth on the battlefield. However, the war was brutal, with horrific conditions and accusations of war crimes on both sides.
Yeah, those colonial wars were brutal as shit. Not exactly Canada's finest hour, eh? So when did Canada finally decide to grow a pair and go solo?
World War I was a turning point. Canada still fought as part of the British Empire, but it marked a shift towards greater independence and a distinct national identity on the world stage.
Right, Vimy Ridge. That was a huge deal for Canada, wasn't it? I've heard stories about that battle.
Vimy Ridge was a pivotal moment in Canadian military history. In 1917, Canadian troops captured the heavily fortified ridge, a feat that had eluded both the British and the French. It was a bloody victory with thousands of casualties, but it cemented Canada's reputation as a formidable fighting force.
Damn, those Canucks fought like hell. But wasn't there a lot of drama back home about conscription? Didn't that tear the country apart?
Prime Minister Borden wanted to introduce conscription to bolster the war effort, but it caused a deep rift between English and French Canadians.
Makes sense. Nobody wants to be forced to fight and die in a war they don't believe in, especially when it's some far-off European clusterfuck.
The conscription crisis exposed deep divisions within Canadian society, highlighting the tensions between English and French Canada. It was a politically charged issue that continues to resonate in Canadian history.
Right, so World War I was a real shit show, even for the Canucks. But then things got even crazier with World War II, right? Did Canada finally ditch the whole Loyal Colony Act and go full-blown badass?
World War II was another major turning point for Canada. This time, they weren't just following the British lead. They declared war, independently asserting their own place on the world stage.
So no more Mother England bullshit. The Canucks finally grew a pair and decided to kick some Nazi ass on their own terms.
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was a cautious fellow. He preferred to play it safe, but Canadian troops were undoubtedly in the thick of it, fighting on multiple fronts.
Right, Juno Beach. That was a balls-out move. Weren't they storming those beaches alongside the Americans and Brits on D-Day?
They sure were. The 3rd Canadian Division landed on Juno Beach, facing fierce resistance from the Germans. They suffered heavy casualties, but managed to secure their objectives.
Damn, those guys were tough as nails. I bet the Germans were shitting their pants when those Canucks came charging ashore.
The Canadians played a vital role in the Normandy landings, and their contributions extended far beyond D-Day. They were also instrumental in the Battle of the Atlantic, protecting those vital supply lines from German U-boats. It was a brutal campaign, but Canadians held their own.
And I vaguely recall something about Canada training a shit ton of pilots for the war effort. Weren't they like the flight school for the entire Allied Air Force?
That's right. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, or BCATP, was a massive undertaking. Canada hosted most of the training facilities and churned out thousands of pilots for the Allied Air Forces. It was a vital contribution to the war effort, providing the Allies with a much-needed influx of skilled pilots.
So basically, Canada was churning out pilots faster than those crowds could shoot them down. That's what I call a goddamn contribution. And didn't Canada also ramp up its industry to help out?
Absolutely. Canadian factories were cranking out tanks, ships, and weapons around the clock. They became a vital arsenal for the Allies, providing the necessary firepower to defeat the Axis powers.
Damn, Canada really stepped up its game in World War II.
The
From hesitant colony to a goddamn powerhouse. So what happened after the Nazis finally bit the dust? Did Canada finally get a chance to chill the fuck out?
Not exactly. The world plunged headfirst into the Cold War, and Canada found itself on the front lines of a new kind of conflict, a geopolitical chess match against the Soviet Union.
Ah, the Cold War. The era of paranoia, nuclear bombs, and those cheesy propaganda films. Wasn't that mostly just a war of nerves?
It was a tense time, no doubt about it. Canada joined NATO, partnered with the U.S. to build those early warning radar stations up in the Arctic, the DDW line, and basically became obsessed with the threat of Soviet aggression.
So Canada went from fighting Nazis to worrying about commies hiding under every bed. Just another day in the life of a global player, I guess. But tell me more about this DUW line. What the hell was that all about?
The D2 line, or Distant Early Warning Line, was a network of radar stations stretching across the Canadian Arctic. It was designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers, providing early warning of a potential nuclear attack.
So basically a giant tripwire to let everyone know if those goddamn commies were launching their nukes. Talk about paranoia.
The threat of nuclear war was very real, and Canada, being so close to the Soviet Union, was right in the crosshairs. The DOW line was a tangible symbol of those Cold War anxieties.
Makes sense. You got to be prepared when those nuke-happy bastards are breathing down your neck. But hold on, didn't things heat up in Korea too? Weren't Canadians involved in that mess?
The Korean War was a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and Canada sent troops to fight on the UN side. They earned a reputation for their tenacity in battles like Kapyong, where they held off a massive Chinese offensive.
So the Canucks were trading blows with the Chinese. Damn, they were really racking up those frequent flyer miles for global conflicts. But speaking of global conflicts, didn't Canada also become famous for peacekeeping after World War II? Weren't they all about promoting peace and love and all that hippie bullshit?
Canada played a major role in shaping the concept of peacekeeping, intervening in various conflicts around the world. They became known for their blue helmets and their efforts to mediate between warring factions. It became a central part of their international identity, projecting an image of neutrality and a commitment to peaceful resolutions.
Right, the blue helmets. Canada, the peacemaker. The goody two-shoes of the international community. But didn't that image get tarnished a bit with Somalia? Wasn't that a total clusterfuck?
The Somalia mission in the early 90s was a turning point for Canada's peacekeeping efforts. It started with good intentions, but quickly descended into chaos and controversy.
Yeah, that whole thing with the airborne regiment was fucked up. Weren't there allegations of torture and murder?
It was a dark chapter in Canadian military history. Soldiers were accused of torturing and killing a Somali teenager, and the subsequent attempts to cover up the incident only made things worse.
Damn, that must have been a PR nightmare for Canada. It definitely shattered that whole peaceful peacekeeper image.
So after Somalia, did Canada shy away from getting involved in those messy conflicts? Were they gun-shy after that debacle?
They became more cautious, that's for sure. They participated in the Gulf War in the early 90s, but mostly in a support role, providing logistical support and medical assistance. They weren't as eager to jump into the thick of the fighting after the Somalia debacle.
Didn't they send some fighter jets to bomb Iraq, though?
They did contribute some CF-18 fighter jets to the air campaign, marking the first time Canadian forces engaged in offensive combat operations since the Korean War. But it was a limited involvement, and they mostly stayed out of the ground war.
So dipping their toes back into the combat pool, but not diving in headfirst. What about the war in Afghanistan? That was a long and messy conflict. Wasn't Canada involved in that for over a decade? Canada joined the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 and remained there for over a decade. Their role evolved over time from combat operations against the Taliban in Kandahar province to training Afghan security forces and providing humanitarian assistance.
Kandahar. That was a real shithole, wasn't it? Didn't the Canadians see some intense fighting there?
Kandahar was a Taliban stronghold, and the Canadians were involved in some of the fiercest fighting of the war. They suffered heavy casualties and faced constant danger from IEDs and ambushes. It was a brutal and unforgiving environment.
Damn, those Canadians were really putting their lives on the line. But wasn't there also a lot of controversy about how Canada handled prisoners in Afghanistan?
There were allegations that Canadian troops were handing over detainees to Afghan authorities who were known to torture prisoners. It sparked a heated debate back home about Canada's role in the war and whether they were complicit in human rights abuses.
So another stain on Canada's supposedly squeaky clean image. It seems like those moral dilemmas are an inevitable part of war no matter how much you try to avoid them. So what about more recent conflicts? Has Canada been involved in anything else, or have they decided to hang up their combat boots for good?
All right. So we've covered a shit ton of ground here. From beaver pelt squabbles to global conflicts, Canada's seen it all. But let's cut the crap and get to the heart of it. What's the takeaway here? What does all this bloodshed and political bullshit mean for Canada today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Canada's military history is a wild tapestry woven with threads of bravery, sacrifice, and some seriously fucked up decisions. It shaped their national identity, their relationship with the world, and even their domestic politics. It's a story of contradictions, a nation grappling with its role on the world stage.
Yeah. No kidding. It's like they're trying to figure out who the fuck they are. Are they the peacekeepers, the warriors, or something in between? Are they the polite, apologetic Canucks everyone thinks they are, or are they something more complex, something darker? It's an ongoing evolution. They've gone from being a loyal colony to an independent nation, from serving the empire to forging their own path. And those shifts haven't always been smooth. The conscription crises, the Somalia scandal, the controversies in Afghanistan. These events have forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their military. They've had to face the fact that power, even when wielded with the best intentions, can have unintended consequences.
Right, because it's easy to maintain that nice guy image when you're sitting on the sidelines sipping tea and talking about diplomacy. But when you're out there dropping bombs and sending troops into harm's way, things get a little more complicated. That nice guy image starts to crack.
Exactly. And that's what makes Canada's story so fascinating. They're wrestling with the realities of power, the moral dilemmas of war, and the responsibility that comes with being a player on the global stage. They're not just the peaceful, peace-loving nation they're often portrayed as. They have a history of violence, a legacy of conflict that they can't ignore.
So what does all this mean for the future of Canada's military? Are they going to keep trying to be everything to everyone, or will they finally pick a lane and stick to it? Will they embrace their inner badass, or will they try to cling to that peacemaker image?
Honestly, I don't have a crystal ball. The future is a slippery bastard, always changing and defying predictions. But I think the key for Canada is to learn from its past, to acknowledge both its triumphs and its failures. They need to have an honest conversation about their role in the world, about the kind of military they want to be, and about the values they want to uphold. They need to reconcile their desire for peace with the realities of a world that's often anything but peaceful.
Yeah, because trying to be the world's peacekeeper while also engaging in controversial wars, that's a recipe for a serious identity crisis. It's like trying to be a vegan butcher. It just doesn't fucking work.
And that's where you, the listener, come in. Engage with this history, challenge the narratives, and ask the tough questions. Don't just accept the easy answers or the simplistic portrayals. Dig deeper, think critically, and decide for yourself what it all means. Because ultimately, the future of Canada's military is in the hands of its citizens. It's their responsibility to shape that future, to hold their leaders accountable, and to ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Canadian military history. It's been a wild ride full of surprises, contradictions, and insights. We've explored the dark underbelly of Canadian history, exposed the myths and the realities, and hopefully sparked some critical thinking along the way.
And remember, this shit's complicated. There are no easy answers, no black and white solutions. It's all a messy tapestry of choices, consequences, and unintended outcomes. But by understanding the past, by grappling with those difficult questions, we can hopefully make more informed choices about the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So go out there, do your own digging, and decide for yourself what it all means. And remember, history is not just a collection of dusty old stories. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to shape our world today. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep questioning the goddamn narratives.
Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your questions sharper, and your bullshit detectors on high alert. And remember, history might not repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes.
Yep.